Unit 2, Lesson 2, Industrial Revolution. Unit 2, Lesson 2, Vocabulary. A little background before we begin our examination of the Industrial Revolution in England. So we've talked at length about the scientific revolution and how that spurred about this intellectual revolution, which encouraged learning and the search for better and newer ways of doing things. That fueled the Enlightenment period, which brought about changes in how men were governed and how men wanted to be governed. This leads us straight to the agricultural revolution, where landowners continued this freedom of thought and expression and began experimenting with better ways to use their land, implementing new machinery, implementing new methodologies and strategies, and finally taking all of that reason and thought and experiments and using it to help breed better animals. Development of the domestic system of production. The domestic system was developed in England in the late 1600s and lasted through the late 1800s. The domestic system was where individuals often fabricated their own clothing, grew their own food, and took care of all of their necessities themselves, hence the domestic or within the home. This domestic system, on a very small scale, could not keep up with demand of a growing population in England. The textile industry helped initiate industrialization, first in England and then throughout the rest of the Western world, including the United States of America. Because before, generations of women made textiles at home as part of the putting out system or this domestic factory system. But after the Industrial Revolution, most modern clothing was manufactured in factories by groups of workers producing more and more garments of clothing than had ever been produced before. So the first industrial revolution happened in England in the 1700s and lasted for about 80 years. It changed human history. It changed human life drastically. There's more things that have been created in the last 250 years than in the previous 5,000 years of known human history. So what was the Industrial Revolution? Well, the Industrial Revolution refers to the greatly increased output of machine-made goods that began in England in the 1700s. And it's that shift away from human-powered and animal-powered machines to manufacturing completed solely by machines that we'll focus on today. This helped Britain take the lead. Some of the advantages Great Britain had was that they had plentiful iron and coal deposits, a river system that one could easily navigate, numerous colonies that supplied raw materials and bought the finished goods, a government that encouraged improvements in transportation and used its navy to protect British trade throughout the world. And it was this textile industry that helped initiate industrialization, where new technology helped speed up production. Manually operated machines for spinning and weaving took time, so inventors came up with ways to speed it up. John Kay's flying shuttle enabled weavers to weave so fast that they outpaced spinners. James Hargreaves solved the issue with the spinning jenny that spun many threads at the same time. Eli Whitney in America, he invents the cotton gin, which helps separate cotton seeds from raw cotton to help increase production even further. And the textile industry again helped initiate industrialization by coming up and creating some of the first factories. They were much bigger machines than before. So they're stored in these long shed type buildings or warehouses and are powered by water and steam. So with England's abundant river system, it made it perfect to have a factory near the water where the flowing water could be used to power the machines inside. And now spinners and weavers would come to these factories to work, and the amount of labor in one warehouse during the Industrial Revolution produced the same amount that used to take an entire district to do before. So just as the photograph shows a steam locomotive engine racing next to a horse, machines were invented to help replace human and animal labor. New energy sources were developed to power this new machinery, starting with like water and steam, and then later on oil and electricity and gas and kerosene. This allowed for the increased use of metals and minerals, mainly aluminum, coal, copper, and iron. James Watt and his steam engine helped revolutionize the Industrial Revolution. I know it's funny to say it that way. But in 1709, Abraham Darby used coal instead of charcoal to help smelt iron. This produced less expensive and better quality iron. And 3 years later, Thomas Newcomen developed a steam engine. It would be another 52 years before James Watt comes along and improves on Thomas's design. This led to a more efficient production of stronger iron. And it was that stronger iron that came from the use of coal, which helped lead to power machines like trains, steamships, and other industrial machines and factories that helped expand production throughout all of England and later on the world. Watt's engine used steam and atmospheric pressure to power pistons and rods that moved machinery. It had a separate condenser to keep the water hot, helping conserve energy. This was a major step up from the original design by Abraham Darby. All of these improvements were developed to replace the domestic system of production. And this factory system is a means for a faster method of production, where workers were concentrated in a set location, producing goods over and over and over again. So, why did the Industrial Revolution start in England? Well, England as a country was relatively calm during the late 1700s and early 1800s. They had capital for investing in this new means of production. They had colonies where they could get raw materials and markets for the manufactured goods. Remember, they could get the raw materials from their colonies and then sell the finished goods back to those colonies. They had an abundance of workers, qualified, eager, ready to begin production in factories. They had the merchant marine system, which not only navigated the internal waterways within England, but helped it with its commerce and helped it with its trade across the English Channel and into mainland Europe. And their regional geography. Though England is an island, it's in such close proximity to the major population hubs in Europe and relatively close to North Africa and Asia. This map helps us demonstrate why the Industrial Revolution began in England in 1750, 1760. You can see this abundant river system throughout England, along with the coal fields, the iron deposits, and the copper mining, all along these riverbeds, all along the harbors and the ports. It made England a prime geographic location with its access to riverways for transportation, but also the abundant natural resources available on mainland England and within its colonies. So focusing on England's resources and the capital resources that they had, many merchants had the capital or money to invest in factory systems. This meant money to buy buildings and equip those buildings with machinery and to produce goods through raw materials that they were able to acquire. The English colonies gave England access to these enormous markets and vast amounts of raw materials. And at the time, they possessed the necessary raw materials to create the means of production, mainly coal and iron. English people could also travel freely from the countryside to the cities. Specifically, with the world's largest merchant fleet, England's citizens and workforce were not stuck to their old ways and they were not stuck to their old towns. They were very much mobile during the Industrial Revolution. Geographically speaking, England's resources are abundant. England is the political center of Great Britain, which is an island. And Great Britain did not suffer fighting on its land during the wars of the 18th century. Nobody invaded, nobody bombed, so the land was in great shape. The island itself had excellent harbors and ports, with many of the rivers and canals stretching from one side of the island to the other. The damp climate helped benefit the textile industry as the threads would not dry out. There was a relatively stable government with a monarchy and parliament, and a relatively stable citizenry. With England's colonial presence throughout the world, there was no internal trade barriers for the manufactured goods from the various factories and operations within England. And so without these trade barriers, it became a prime location for international trade on land and at sea. The Industrial Revolution improved transportation dramatically. Ships, for one, went from the original wooden ships to iron ships and then transformed even further to steel ships, which were lighter and stronger and easier to fabricate than the iron and wooden ships and would last longer. We went from wind-powered sails on wooden ships to steam-powered boilers on iron and steel ships. Trains, automobiles were created and improved upon during the Industrial Revolution. Communication improved, beginning with the telegraph and the telephone, and then later inventions like Marconi's radio, which can send signals through the air that could be received by another radio over great distances. So this leads us to this revolution in transportation, as canals helped improve transportation throughout England. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, factories need an efficient way to bring in resources and transport goods out. So canals are opened up throughout the country. Canals start being built, but soon are not profitable, so they fail. This allows locomotives to become the way everyone moves materials more freely throughout the country. Continuing this revolution in transportation, it's the steam locomotive which drives railroads. The invention of that steam locomotive makes railroads possible, as the world's first major rail line opened in 1830 in England. And by the 1870s, only 40 years later, railroads were all over Europe and North America and helped transport large quantities of raw materials and finished goods throughout the world. And this leads us to the concept of supply and demand, where cheaper goods lead to an increasing demand. You see, with the invention of the railroads throughout the Industrial Revolution, goods are being manufactured for less money, so they can be sold for less. And because of the ease that railroads allow the goods to be manufactured in one spot or one location and shipped throughout the country and throughout the world, it allows for a greater sense of supply and demand. As more goods were made by machines, the individual price of these goods fell. And as the prices fell, more people bought the goods. This leads to a greater demand and like a sense of consumerism where we're always happy consumers to buy more products because they're getting cheaper and cheaper. This map shows the numerous canal systems throughout England as highlighted by the red lines and the railroad lines as highlighted by these gray lines with the sort of railroad spikes on it. So how exactly does supply and demand affect price? Well, think about this. When there's a shortage of an item, demand increases for that item. And as demand increases, as more people want it, the supply of that item decreases. This causes the prices of that item to rise because there's less of it. It becomes a rare commodity. So that's what a shortage is. When you have a surplus, that's when supplies of a given item increase. And because it's so readily available, it's abundant, the demand decreases. This leads to prices falling from a surplus in supply. Industrialization began to spread throughout Europe and North America after the successes that were found in England. There were vast supplies of coal and iron ore deposits throughout mainland Europe, including Austria-Hungary, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, as well as in the United States, in North America, and in Canada. Scenes like this depicted here of a paddle steamer traveling the Potomac River in the United States around 1860. River travel before this was slow, before the steam engines, because boats relied on sails or water currents. And so, if the water was relatively flat and not moving, or if there wasn't a lot of wind, ships were kind of ground to a halt. But steamers, first developed in England, helped revolutionize water travel. And so, as industrialization is spreading throughout the world, other nations industrialize. At first, we talked about Britain as the world's industrial giant. They're the first to go full industrialization. And Belgium, right there across the English Channel, starts to industrialize when a British mechanic opened up a factory. And by the mid 1800s, other countries are starting to catch up to this British model. Germany unites and becomes the leading industrial power in Europe. There was a large amount of resources in Germany, after all. And this helped them establish themselves as a power on the world stage. It actually leads to Germany being responsible for World War I and World War II, but we get to that at a later unit. America will become the world's industrial giant after industry spreads throughout North America. But industry didn't always spread evenly. In Eastern and Southern Europe, they developed more slowly because they had a lack of natural resources. Russia had an abundance of resources, but they had a lot of political problems. Japan industrialized rapidly because of their government and the resources, and because of their trade partners with the West. All of this, all the industrialization throughout the world, helped bring about many changes in the social, economic, and political lives of each of the countries. At first, people are exploited in factories, and then they soon fight back. Politics will change to meet the demands of society, and this created the scenario where Western powers dominate world affairs for the next 200 years.